Hello and welcome to the Science of Conversations. On this channel, I'll be talking about conversations and other human interactions through the lens of science, specifically neuroscience, cognition, and other modalities. My name is Michelle Stills and I'm the conversation coach. Today, I'm going to talk about freezing in conversation. What's that about? You know the feeling. It's probably happened to you. It's happened to most of us. Unfortunately, it happens to some people a lot. And we want to find a way to stop that. And thanks to science, we do know some ways now to get a handle on that. Because what's happening is you're having an emotional response, a threat response. So let's take a look at that as a progression. And the one I like to use is one, you're talking. Things seem fine. We're going to assume in this video that everything is fine. It's a good conversation. You weren't particularly nervous to begin with. So you're talking, something happens, and you feel some kind of way. And that vagary is important here because that's what our brains naturally do. We don't need the right answer, or our brains don't. We need an answer. And so what can happen in those moments if we don't learn to slow down, control them, and get a better handle on the emotional response is that our brains will assign a meaning that isn't necessarily the truth. For example, the conversation partner may have had a look on their face that you interpreted or perceived as rejection or something else. Maybe they were hungry, right? They may have needed a granola bar, or maybe they were having their own amygdala hijack. You may have been reacting to a question. Our brain does some pretty interesting things when we're asked questions, especially depending on how the questions are asked. And that's something to remember when it's your turn to ask a question. Questions like, why did you do that? That's not an open question. That feels like I did something, I did something wrong, and you know the answer to the question. We want to avoid that. And if someone said that to you, you may have perceived that as a threat. The other thing that can happen is something called artifacts and transference. And what that means is something similar to this happened somewhere in some other conversation, potentially with this conversational partner or with someone else. It could have happened repeatedly once, and it was bad enough that your limbic system has taken a snapshot of it, and now it's coming back up in conversation, or we're not sure where it came from, but we know it somehow became part of your conversational pattern and part of your neural pathway, which informs your behavior when these things happen. So what happened was you're talking, something happens, you feel some kind of way. And we want to be really careful with that way because we need to learn to stop here and appraise or reappraise. What do we think really happened? Because often we decide it was something really bad, really negative. We feel excluded, judged, persecuted. And so then that perpetuates our hijack. And we become unable to respond the way we want to respond. And that's what we want to do. We want to learn how to be able to show up as ourselves confidently and say what we have to say. So, from a more scientific point of view, what is happening in the amygdala hijack, which was coined by Daniel Goleman, who wrote Emotional Intelligence, which is a really important skill to work on, is that when you perceive a threat response, this part of your brain, there's one on each side, it's amygdala, reacts, it goes into action, and it starts sending signals to other parts of your brain that send signals to other parts of your body. And we want to pay attention to those signals. And we'll get back to that in a second. But you start producing neurochemistry and hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine, and they lead to the freeze, a fight, flight, or freeze response in conversation. And what that means is basically we like to refer to that is your lizard brain. So now you have a lizard in charge of your conversations. So what we need to do is take a moment and just take a breath and say to ourselves, what has happened here? What's really going on? And when I say we want to take a breath, I mean literally. And I'm going to quickly go over this in this video, and then I'll follow up in a separate video going into more detail. What we want to do is when we notice the first symptom, the first sensation of feeling some kind of way, and that may be that our heart races, we start to sweat a little bit, our jaw gets tight, our mouth gets dry, we feel heat in our head. It could also be a thought. Wow, they don't like me. I don't know what they're thinking. I feel rejected. What can I say that won't get me in trouble? What are these thoughts? What are your thoughts? It's important that we label them and we pay attention to them. So take the time to look at that in the moment. You may think you don't have time, but you do. And if you look at all that you're already doing in this situation, you'll see that you have a lot of time. So when we start to feel that symptom, whether it is a physical symptom or a thought we're having, we want to go into a breathing exercise, because this breathing exercise is the foundation for a lot of emotional regulation things that we're going to cover down the road on this channel. And we have to start somewhere. So let's start with this breath. So you've noticed that you're feeling some kind of way, and we know that's going to result in freeze. We've got to get the neurochemistry down regulated. So what we want to do is take an 8 to 12 second breath. And it's a little bit like box breathing, except for it's abbreviated box breathing, because we're in a conversation. We don't have time to do a bunch of breathing exercises and meditation that are long and drawn out. We've got a few seconds, and luckily that's all we need. So we're going to count that breath, and I'm going to only go to 4, and I'm 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, up to 7. And it is important that you count it 1001, 1002, because that gives you a more accurate representation of time. When you get to the top of your breath, to the 4, 5, 6, 7, however far you've gone, we want you to briefly pause, and just briefly, because if you hold your breath, the lizard is going to think you're trying to kill it now, and that's not going to go well. That is going to perpetuate the hijack, create another hijack, keep the anxiety cycle going, because the lizard really is just doing its job to protect you from danger, to make sure you mobilize in those moments you need to mobilize, or you freeze in those moments you need to freeze to stay alive. So when we reach the top and just briefly pause, we're going to exhale the same way. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, on up to 7 or 8. And when we do this, now it's essential that we pay attention to our breathing and maintain normal breathing here now, okay? We don't want to get too deep, we don't want to be too shallow, and we certainly don't want to breathe too rapidly, because again, this sends signals to your amygdala, to the lizard, who will take control of your life and your conversations, that something is wrong, that you're in trouble. So back to normal breathing at this point. And this gives us a moment to say, okay, what's going on? Where are we in this conversation? What comes next? And we're going to cover that in the next video, that is going to be a more in-depth look at breathing. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please hit like and subscribe to the channel. Do all the things. And very importantly, please comment and let me know what's going on in your conversations that you'd like to talk about, that you'd like to hear me talk about. What other things can we cover?